In other words, when the decision was made that Dick York could no longer continue.
As the most engaging couple on television in the 1960s, they captivated millions of viewers with their magnetic chemistry on Bewitched. However, beneath the humor and charm, Elizabeth Montgomery was harboring a secret about Dick York that would follow her for many years. Beneath the flawless sitcom, grins were veiled tensions and hints of buried emotions, and intense moments that made it difficult to distinguish between acting and truth. Off camera, there were two long looks, two personal chats, and a bond that neither of them publicly acknowledged. Years later, Elizabeth revealed something she had kept hidden, which would dispel the myth that followers believed they were aware of. You won't ever see their on-screen marriage or Bewitched in the same way again after you see what was truly going on between these two legends, so stay tuned. Something unsaid started to simmer behind the camera as soon as Dick York, as Darren Stevens, strolled onto the enchanted set. York saw much more than a co-star, but the world saw a clever, loyal spouse to Elizabeth Montgomery's Samantha. Later, crew members would mutter about his lingering looks, tiny smiles, and the softer tone of his voice when she was close. Rumors circulated that his emotions for her extended well beyond the script, as he would find excuses to remain in her company during quiet moments in between takes. Elizabeth initially dismissed it as warm friendliness. She was accustomed to receiving attention from men, particularly in the television industry of the mid-1960s, when prominent women were frequently exalted. However, this was not like the others. According to one source, York's puppy dog obsession persisted. With every episode, it grew more intense, generating an unsaid tension that was never captured on camera. He never did anything wrong in public, but it became more difficult to ignore him. Elizabeth's minor changes, such as her tighter smile in some sequences and her swift retreat when York leaned too close, were seen by those who worked closely with her on set. Maintaining professionalism was important to her, and it got more difficult as his admiration remained veiled. Nevertheless, the Stevens marriage was the epitome of sitcom romance for millions of fans, demonstrating that TV magic could be smooth. However, beneath that facade, Elizabeth started to experience a subtle pressure, not from any overt actions, but rather from the ongoing undercurrent of attention that made every shared scene a delicate balancing act. Though unsaid, York's emotions were obvious enough for perceptive crew members to see. Even fans were unable to identify how this dynamic might influence the tone of their on-screen interaction. It was more than a performance. Something real was being channeled by York, something Elizabeth needed to carefully handle. And this undercurrent only became more pronounced as the seasons passed. Both of them were unaware that this unsaid conflict would serve as the basis for a far bigger narrative that would reappear decades after Bewitched had stopped airing. No one on set could have predicted how that story would clash with York's personal struggles in the following chapter. Dick York's life took a tragic turn on the set of the 1959 movie They Came to Cordura, long before Bewitched. He once experienced a sudden, excruciating pain that shot through his back as he was filming a scene that needed him to lift and carry hefty railroad ties. What first appeared to be a torn muscle would actually be a permanent spinal damage that would change the patient's life. At the time, he forced himself to ignore the discomfort. Rest was scarce due to Hollywood schedules, but the harm was already done. The injury was a persistent concern by 1964 when he was cast as Darren Stevens. Every moment was a struggle due to long days on set, countless retakes, and the requirement to keep up a positive, upbeat performance. His silent companion, painkillers, became his only means of surviving demanding production schedules. However, the side effects, exhaustion, mood swings, and mental haze were beginning to affect his work. Elizabeth Montgomery took note. Between shots, she noticed him flinching and quietly shifting in his chair to release tension on his back. In private discussions with crew members, she even expressed concern about the extent of the grief he was concealing. However, York never asked for preferential treatment because of his pride and possibly his emotions for her. He believed that every moment with Elizabeth was worth the anguish, even if it meant straining his body to the breaking point. The injury evolved into more than just a physical hardship throughout the years. York's worst flare-ups were accompanied by strange hallucinations. When the anguish was at its worst, He once told a buddy that he could hear a band playing bagpipes all day and all night. Those around him felt uneasy during these moments, but he dismissed them with a fake smile. Nevertheless, his health was deteriorating, and it was getting harder to maintain the flawless Darren Stevens persona. No one outside the set realized that this gradual deterioration was preparing the audience for Bewitched's sudden and startling departure, which would astound Elizabeth Montgomery and millions of admirers. It was unexpected. Dick York was on the set one day, joking with Elizabeth Montgomery in between takes. Without a farewell episode or public explanation, he abruptly replaced him on Bewitched and disappeared the next day. The change to a new Darren seemed sudden, almost startling, to watchers at home. However, the reality was much more agonizing behind the scenes. York was at the limit of his back problem. He could no longer use medicines and determination to get through the discomfort. York passed out on the set of 1969's Daddy Does His Thing, the 5th season episode. He lay on the floor, immobile, and crew members hurried to his aid. There was more to that moment than a flare-up. His body was requesting that he give up. He was removed from the show and never came back. The network made no formal announcements or lavish farewells. Particularly when it came to an actor's health, the industry at the time was quick to brush such incidents under the rug. Discreetly, York's name vanished from the scripts, and Dick Sargent assumed the part as though nothing had occurred. The change was difficult for Elizabeth. She had to maintain the show's operations, adjust to a new on-screen husband, and act as though nothing was wrong. For her part, she missed a co-star with whom she had collaborated for 5 demanding years. Someone who had been a part of her everyday life, despite the underlying undercurrent of unsaid feelings. Fans conjectured endlessly. It was thought by several that York's dismissal was due to issues with producers. Others murmured about drug problems. Few were aware of the true extent of his pain or the battles he had been fighting in silence. York himself chose to discreetly withdraw from the spotlight at the time, rarely addressing the specifics. However, the narrative did not finish with his departure. After leaving the bright lights of Hollywood, York's life would descend into a period of financial ruin, health issues, and lonely obscurity until his story would once more include Elizabeth's name in a way that would lead to decades of rumors and discussion. Almost immediately after leaving Bewitched, Dick York's world became smaller. Once beaming into millions of homes every week, the man was now limited to his own, fighting a body that would not heal and ongoing discomfort. Acting employment rapidly becomes scarce. If an actor couldn't ensure he would survive a lengthy shoot, few producers would engage him. When the offers did come, they were either too little for him or so far below his prior status that it was like conceding defeat. Once a concealed wound, his injury had developed into a persistent enemy. His movements were deliberate and cautious, and his days were characterized by periods of bed rest, a reminder of what he had lost with every step. He relied more on prescription medicines to lessen the ache. In addition to dulling his vitality, they muffled the agony, trapping him in a vicious cycle of dependency and exhaustion. Then came financial difficulties. Without a reliable source of revenue, York's debts go unpaid. He was unable to be sustained by the constant flow of residuals from Bewitched. As the months stretched into years, friends slipped away. Celebrities in Hollywood are celebrated quickly, but forgotten even more quickly when the filming ceased. Nevertheless, there were times of unyielding perseverance. When he could, York worked from home as a voice actor, adding his cozy, recognizable voice to minor projects and advertisements. He started writing as well, putting all of his thoughts and recollections into a book that would eventually become his autobiography. He would provide information about his suffering, hallucinations, and the silent destruction of losing his profession in these pages. Throughout it all, rumors about Elizabeth Montgomery drifted in and out of his sphere of influence. Some said she had offered encouragement in a private message. Others vowed that she had completely avoided it, too preoccupied with her own life and profession to look back. There was still confusion about the facts, which only served to foster conjecture. However, as the 1980s came to an end, York's name was set to make a surprise reappearance, drawing Elizabeth Montgomery's memories into his narrative once more, and starting a rumor that continues to split fans today. The idea that Elizabeth Montgomery had visited Dick York in his latter years began as a rumor, an unsubstantiated rumor that circulated among fans. The tale went that she had shown up at his humble Michigan house out of the blue, a silent, heartfelt reunion between two former co-stars who had spent so much time together on screen and had so many wordless experiences in common. According to this account, she assured him that she would always remember him, and their eyes were filled with sadness as they parted. Perhaps it was too touching, but it was a touching image. Through internet forums, TV nostalgia magazines, and eventually social media posts, the story gradually gained traction. Some even asserted that they heard it from an eyewitness. The issue? Nobody ever provided evidence. Only hazy memories and third-person stories that changed with each recounting. No photographs or first-hand experiences. York's close friends have categorically stated that it never occurred. They contend that York's deteriorating health and immobility closely governed his surroundings in his final years. He rarely had visitors and stayed mostly in bed or in a chair near the window. Because Elizabeth never ever alluded to such a visit in interviews or personal writings, those who knew her maintain that she never went. The rumor, however, is unabated. Some fans find the concept too reassuring to abandon. The idea that before the film's conclusion, the enchanted on-screen couple shared one last touching moment off-screen softens the details of their story, omitting the conflict, the harm, and the years spent apart. York never responded to the accusation in public. He ignored the issue, either out of indifference, consideration for Elizabeth's privacy, or just because it was false. This silence simply served to increase conjecture and let the myth spread unchallenged. However, beneath the surface of this idealized portrayal comes a far more nuanced reality, one connected to York's last struggles with suffering, destitution, and disease, as well as how those latter years tore away the facade Hollywood had created around him. Only when he was gone will that fact become clear. Dick York's world had shrunk to the confines of his modest Michigan house by the early 1990s. Decades of suffering have left his once tall physique weak, as well as the cost of prescription drugs. His career terminated due to a back ailment that never fully recovered. Actually, it had gotten worse, leaving him bedridden for extended periods of time. It was a tiring experience to even sit up straight for more than a few minutes. York, however, discovered a new meaning in those latter years. Using his voice and phone calls, he started a charity initiative called Acting for Life, which aims to support the homeless and increase awareness of those who are marginalized in society. He called hundreds of organizations, legislators, and possible funders from his bed. It was a silent, unyielding act of rebellion against the constraints his body had imposed. But his physical deterioration was unrelenting. York, who smoked heavily for years, suffered from acute emphysema and frequently ran out of breath after just a few phrases. Friends noted that he was spending more time in the hospital and that he was no longer talking about his time in Hollywood. The everyday realities of surviving another day seemed to have sealed away any unresolved thoughts that may have existed about Bewitched or Elizabeth Montgomery. Fans who recalled him as the endearing, witty Darren Stevens showered him with condolences when he passed away on February 20th, 1992, at the age of 63. In a brief public statement, Elizabeth Montgomery acknowledged his contribution to the show and expressed her condolences. Her remarks, for some, rekindled the gossip about a covert farewell visit. Others saw it as a dignified farewell to a part of her life that she had long since closed. However, the reality of their relationship, its conflicts, silences, and perhaps lost connections, remained unaltered beneath the kind remarks and sentimental sentiments. It seemed as though York's life and the one mystery that had left admirers wondering for decades had come to an end. 2 years later, Elizabeth Montgomery would enter her own last chapter due to an unexpected turn of events, shedding a fresh, eerie light on their entire common past. Elizabeth Montgomery started thinking more candidly about her career and the individuals who had influenced it in her final years. In contrast to her prime, interviews from the mid-1990s reveal a softer, more open side. Although she hardly ever mentioned Dick York by name, people who knew her said that in private, she eventually admitted the complex reality of their time together. Elizabeth acknowledged, according to a close friend, that she had always known York was in love with her. She wasn't upset with them. She viewed them as tragic and flattering, if anything. It was flattering since it implied that they had some genuine chemistry on film. It was tragic because it had put up an imperceptible barrier between them that neither of them dared to cross. According to reports, she admitted that she wished things had gone differently. They may have had a closer friendship because he was healthier and had fewer burdens. There were also indications that she wished she had contacted him during his last years, but without that tension looming in the background. She is reported to have said, "I should have called," during a late-night talk. The remark gave the public narrative a bittersweet touch, although it is unclear if this had anything to do with the ongoing suspicions of a covert visit. By 1995, Elizabeth herself found herself in a losing battle. She kept her colon cancer diagnosis a secret after receiving it in March, till treatment was too late. She only did a few last interviews, each with a note of closure, as her health quickly deteriorated. Her remarks regarding Bewitched and its actors had additional significance during these times, as though she were leaving thoughtfully chosen words for people who were still curious about the past. Fans had two entwined legacies after Elizabeth died on May 18, 1995, at the age of just 62. The unsolved, deeply real narrative of the actors who created Samantha and Darren's beautiful fantasy. And the truth of Dick York, her truth, stayed just out of grasp in that space between imagination and reality. However, there is one more point that is rarely mentioned, and it might be the closest thing to a solution we will ever find. Those closest to Elizabeth Montgomery started sharing tidbits of conversation and brief comments she had made in the weeks following her death. That seemed more significant today. One friend recounted a peaceful afternoon shortly before she passed away, during which the topic of Bewitched was discussed. "You know, some things are better left between two people," Elizabeth added with a slight smile. The word stayed, even though she didn't elaborate and no one asked her to. She stored a little collection of souvenirs from her years on the program, including handwritten note scripts, candid set shots, and even a black and white still of her and Dick York, according to another confidant. In the intervals between takes, it was stowed away, not framed or on display. Nobody knew if it was nostalgia or anything more profound. She never had the opportunity to talk in depth about York, his sentiments, their working relationship, or the rumors that had followed them both. There was no time for memoirs or candid interviews because her sickness progressed too rapidly. Rather, she left behind a patchwork of subliminal confessions and half-hints. Not enough to solve the mystery, but enough to keep it alive. That lack of resolution got ingrained in the folklore for admirers. Their narrative became something more than either of them when it was thought that Elizabeth Montgomery carried the whole truth about Dick York, his dedication, their conflicts, and possibly a last act of compassion before taking it to the cemetery. It became into an unsolvable riddle with no answers, allowing for never-ending conjecture but never offering resolution. Perhaps it was what she wanted to do. Some stories aren't meant to be neatly wrapped up, after all. Some realities are too intimate, too entwined with private suffering and transient happiness, to be revealed to the public. The image that remains is the one that we began with, Samantha and Darren, smiling through a flawless television marriage that concealed much more than it showed. And there is a truth that only they ever knew that falls somewhere between the staged wonder and the agony of real life. And neither ever gave a complete account. They were the ideal pair on screen, loving, playful, and unwaveringly bonded. Off-screen, they were two individuals juggling a difficult combination of love, limits, and the constant demands of Hollywood. Dick York's sudden departure from Bewitched, his terrible injuries, and his secret crush all became strands in a narrative that extended well beyond the glitzy set of the program. It told a tale of silent sacrifices, unsaid emotions, and unscripted encounters. For the remainder of her life, Elizabeth Montgomery kept her portion of that tale close at hand, sharing only tidbits in infrequent, unguarded occasions. She never displayed the truth in public, regardless of whether she ever went to see York in his last days or just carried the burden of wishing she had. It was not for the most loyal fans, the top programs, or even the tabloids. She owned it, stored aside with the recollections of the years they spent together. Perhaps it is why we are still captivated by their narrative. It's important to consider what we don't know as well as what we do know. The clues, gossip, and brief remarks that allude to something more profound, yet never provide proof. Their mutual silence feels almost sacrosanct in an era where every element of a celebrity's life is scrutinized and shared, as though they had formed an unwritten agreement to preserve some memories. The conclusion that remains isn't truly a conclusion at all. Two celebrities, forever ensnared by the roles that made them famous and a truth that eluded them. Perhaps that is Bewitched's last magic trick, leaving us to wonder what was imagined, what was genuine, and what was hidden in plain sight even after all these years. And maybe it's because of that unsolved question that their story still has a spell-like quality today. That didn't wear off completely.